The sun had barely dipped below the California horizon when Rebecca Lawson pulled into the gravel parking lot of Marty's Diner, a small roadside stop along Highway 76. The neon sign buzzed in the dusk, flickering between Marty's and Artie's like it couldn't decide if it wanted to stay alive. She cut the engine of her faded blue pickup and sat for a moment, staring at her own reflection in the rearview mirror. The same calm, composed eyes looked back, eyes that had seen sandstorms in Iraq, waves taller than buildings in SEAL training, and the empty stare of men who didn't come home. But tonight, those eyes just looked tired. Rebecca brushed her dark hair behind her ears, grabbed her wallet, and stepped out. The air smelled of fried onions and motor oil. She wasn't looking for conversation, just a hot cup of coffee, maybe a quiet dinner, and a bit of silence that didn't echo with memories. Inside, the diner was dim and half empty. A jukebox in the corner played a slow country tune, and the hum of an old refrigerator filled the gaps in conversation. She slid into a booth near the window, ordered black coffee, and pulled out her phone, not to scroll, but just to keep her hands busy. That's when she heard it, laughter. Loud, mocking laughter. A group of 4 men sat at the counter, all wearing leather jackets with patches that read Steel Vultures MC. Biker gang. Locals. The kind of men who thought small towns were playgrounds for intimidation. One of them, a thick-shouldered man with a gray beard and faded tattoos, noticed Rebecca's navy cap resting beside her coffee cup. He nudged his buddy and grinned. "Well, look at that," he said loudly enough for the whole diner to hear. "Didn't know the Navy was letting girls play soldier now." The others laughed. Rebecca didn't even glance their way. She dealt with worse, in training, in combat, in life. She sipped her coffee slowly, savoring the heat. The waitress, Marty's niece Lisa, shot Rebecca an apologetic look. She knew these men. Trouble magnets, always drunk, always loud. But tonight, something in the air was heavier than usual. The bearded biker stood up and swaggered over. His boots thudded against the tiled floor, the sound like a countdown. He stopped by her booth and leaned against the edge of her table, reeking of cheap whiskey and arrogance. "You hear me, sweetheart?" he said, voice low but sharp. "Asked you a question. Navy, huh? Bet you never even saw a gun." Rebecca lifted her gaze slowly. Her voice was calm, flat. "Please leave me alone." The man chuckled, pretending to stagger back in mock offense. "Oh, she's got a mouth. Probably thinks she's tough, 'cause she did push-ups for Uncle Sam." His friends roared with laughter from the counter. One of them banged his beer bottle on the counter like it was the funniest thing he'd heard all week. Lisa stepped forward. "Tank, leave her alone," she said nervously. "She's just trying to eat." Tank, the leader, apparently, grinned wider. "Eat? Sure, maybe she wants company." He slid into the booth across from Rebecca, uninvited. Rebecca didn't move, didn't flinch, just stared at him. He leaned in closer, his tone turning darker. "Tell me, Navy girl, you ever kill anyone? Or you just played dress-up for a few years?" Rebecca exhaled slowly through her nose. Inside, a muscle in her jaw tightened. She had learned control the hard way, in boot camp, where losing your temper meant failure. In combat, where losing your temper meant death. "I'm asking you nicely," she said evenly. "Get up. Walk away." Tank chuckled again, but something about her tone, not loud, not angry, just steady, made him hesitate. He didn't like that feeling. So, to reassert himself, he reached for the coffee cup and dumped it over the table, spilling it across her hands. The diner went silent. Lisa gasped, "Hey!" "What the hell?" But before she could finish, Tank leaned forward, spat directly in Rebecca's face, and sneered. "Guess SEALs aren't that tough after all." Time froze. For 3 seconds, Rebecca didn't move. Her eyes, normally soft brown, turned cold, sharp as a blade. Every fiber of her training screamed neutralize the threat, but she wasn't on the battlefield. Not here. Not now. She reached for a napkin, wiped the spit from her cheek, folded it neatly, and set it aside. Then she stood. Her voice was barely a whisper. "You're not worth it." Tank blinked. He expected shouting, maybe a punch. Instead, she walked right past him, quietly, controlled, calm. As she stepped out into the night, she could hear their laughter behind her again, louder now, triumphant. To them, she was weak. To her, they were nothing. But as she opened her truck door, she caught her reflection in the glass. For a moment, she saw not the tired woman she'd become, but the warrior she used to be. Her father's voice echoed in her mind. Never let them mistake silence for surrender. Becky, silence is just patience with purpose. She gripped the steering wheel until her knuckles turned white. Then she exhaled, started the engine, and drove into the dark. Later that night, as she sat at her small apartment overlooking the coast, Rebecca opened her old seal field journal, a habit she hadn't revisited in months. On the first blank page, she wrote only one sentence: "Never mistake silence for weakness." She closed the notebook and stared out the window, where the moonlight shimmered across the Pacific. The ocean always calmed her. Its endlessness, its silence, its strength. But that night, something shifted. She wasn't angry, not in the way most people would be. It was deeper, colder. A kind of quiet determination that came from knowing there were lines you didn't cross. The next morning, she went for her usual 5 a.m. run. Her boots hit the sand in rhythm. Thud, thud. Each stride cleared her head. But as she ran past the diner again, she slowed. Parked outside were the same bikes, black, rusted, with the vulture emblem glaring back at her. She didn't stop, didn't stare, just kept running. But in her mind, something clicked, the same mental precision she used to plan missions overseas. Observation, timing, threat assessment. By the time she returned home, sweat rolling down her back, she already knew 2 things. Those men were a problem this town was too scared to face. She wasn't scared. She wasn't looking for a fight. But she also knew that some lessons in life only came the hard way, and for the men who spat in her face, that lesson hadn't arrived yet. It would. And when it did, they'd realize that disrespecting a Navy SEAL wasn't just stupid, it was deadly. Rebecca poured herself another cup of coffee, stared out at the sunrise, and muttered under her breath, "Let them laugh while they can." The wind rattled her open window, carrying the smell of salt and freedom. In the distance, the ocean roared, soft, powerful, patient. Just like her. Rebecca Lawson's calm exterior wasn't born overnight. It had been forged in fire, sweat, and relentless discipline, long before the biker gang dared to humiliate her in a small California diner. Her story began decades earlier, under the scorching sun of Tucson, Arizona, where life had a way of splitting people into those who adapted and those who broke. Beck, as everyone called her, had grown up in a small neighborhood, surrounded by dust, tumbleweeds, and an unrelenting heat that baked the streets all summer. Her father, Frank Lawson, a retired Marine, had a presence that filled the room without a word. His hands were calloused, his posture rigid, and his expectations higher than most parents dared to set. He taught Beck everything he knew about resilience, endurance, and respect. She remembered the summers when her father would wake her before dawn. Up, he'd bark, voice like gravel. Run the block twice. Then push-ups. Then sit-ups. And don't complain unless you're ready to bleed for it. Beck had learned early that strength wasn't about size. It wasn't about yelling louder or swinging harder. Strength was about control, timing, and knowing when to strike, lessons that would serve her well later in life. School was a battlefield of its own. Teachers dismissed her as just another girl who wanted attention when she excelled in science and math. Boys teased her for being tough, calling her names that stung but never broke her. She fought only when necessary, always calculating. By 16, she could read people's intentions in a glance, a skill most adults never mastered. At 18, Beck made the decision that would change her life. She enlisted in the U.S. Navy. It was not a casual choice. Many tried to dissuade her. Friends said it was dangerous. Family worried. But Beck had always been drawn to challenges, to proving that limits existed only to be broken. Boot camp at Great Lakes Naval Station was merciless. The first day, she was thrown into a sea of angry, exhausted recruits, many of them twice her size. Drill instructors screamed, snapped, and pushed everyone to their breaking point. Beck learned quickly, not to argue, not to complain, just to survive and excel. The biggest test came when she applied for SEAL training, a program infamous for breaking even the strongest candidates. At Bud.'s Basic Underwater Demolition SEAL training, she faced the gauntlet known as Hell Week. Days without sleep. Endless runs. Drown-proofing exercises where candidates were tied and submerged repeatedly until they could no longer tell up from down. Each failure was met with humiliation, ridicule, and the threat of dismissal. Her male counterparts, at first dismissive, tried to undermine her. "Girl won't last a week," one had laughed. But Beck had learned patience and precision from her father. She observed, analyzed, and struck at the exact moment she needed to. She endured each physical and mental trial with a quiet intensity that made instructors pause and take notice. Weeks turned into months, and the recruits fell one by one. Beck pushed through exhaustion, hypothermia, and fear. When the final day came, she stood in formation, dripping wet and shaking, yet unbroken. The moment her trident was pinned to her uniform, the emblem of a Navy SEAL, she understood fully what it meant to earn respect through discipline, not words. Combat deployments followed, each more harrowing than the last. Beck had been part of operations in hostile terrain, high-risk extractions, and missions where one wrong move meant death. She learned to read the environment, anticipate danger, and make split-second decisions with absolute precision. She had killed in combat, yes, but only when absolutely necessary, always controlled, always calculated. Yet the lessons weren't just about physical skill. Beck had learned that mental resilience mattered more than muscle. She saw men break under stress who had been lauded as tough back home. She saw families torn apart, communities destroyed, and yet she carried on, disciplined and steady. Each trial reinforced a single truth. The mind must be stronger than the chaos around it, or the chaos will consume you. After years of deployments, missions, and relentless training, Beck returned to civilian life, carrying invisible scars. The transition was harder than any Hell Week. The world she came back to moved slowly, lacking the precision and discipline she had internalized. Crowds overwhelmed her. Noise jarred her. Small talk felt meaningless. She found solace only in familiar routines, long runs, early mornings, and moments of reflection. Her father had passed away a few years prior, leaving her with memories and lessons that had never seemed so vital. His voice still echoed in her mind. Strength isn't what you show them. Strength is what they never see coming. It was that strength, cultivated over decades, that allowed her to handle the diner incident with control rather than rage. She didn't strike the biker. She didn't yell. She didn't allow them the satisfaction of a reaction. In that moment, as they laughed and mocked her, she was thinking patience, observation, timing. Beck had learned that patience didn't mean passivity. It meant choosing the right moment to act the right moment to make your move. It was a lesson drilled into her through sleepless nights, pain, and loss. The men in the diner had no idea who they were dealing with, nor did they understand the decades of preparation that had made her exactly who she was today. As she drove away from the diner, the city lights fading behind her, Beck's mind replayed the incident in detail. She visualized every angle, every movement, every possible outcome. It wasn't anger. It was assessment, calculation, preparation. Because one day they would learn. And when they did, it would not be a chaotic brawl. It would be precise. It would be undeniable. And it would be fatal in its impact. Not because she sought revenge, but because she had trained to act when the time was right. Rebecca pulled into her quiet apartment complex near the coast, the sound of waves crashing in the distance providing a rhythm she could trust. She entered her small, sparsely furnished apartment and went straight for her journal. Writing came instinctively. She detailed the incident in the diner, the laughter, the spit, the mockery. But she didn't write about anger. She wrote about observation, about patience, about control. Never mistake silence for weakness, she wrote again, the words tracing the line between past and future. As the moonlight spilled across her desk, she allowed herself a small smile. The incident at the diner was not the first time someone had tried to test her. It would not be the last. But now she had clarity. The world hadn't caught her off guard. It had only awakened her. Outside, the distant sound of the ocean mingled with the hum of a neon sign down the street. For most, it was ordinary, mundane. For Rebecca Lawson, it was the beginning of a calculation, a plan, and a future confrontation that would teach those who disrespected her the most important lesson of all: never underestimate a Navy SEAL. She closed her journal, poured a cup of coffee, and stared at the horizon. The past had built her, the present was testing her, and the future, inevitable, deliberate, and precise, awaited. And when it came, she would be ready. Returning to civilian life had been nothing like Rebecca Lawson imagined. After years of precise operations, high-risk extractions, and life-or-death decisions, she found herself in a world that moved at a painfully slow pace. People hustled, but they were directionless. Conversations were trivial. Noise surrounded her, yet she felt strangely alone. It was as if she'd returned to a place that had forgotten how to survive. Her apartment overlooked the coast, waves crashing rhythmically against the cliffs below. The sound, constant and unyielding, reminded her of her training. In the Navy, she had learned to rely on rhythms, heartbeats, breath, the subtle shifts of the environment. Now she relied on the ocean to reset her mind, to ground her when everything else seemed overwhelming. Beck filled her days teaching at a small self-defense studio in town. Local women, most of them young and inexperienced, looked up to her with a mixture of admiration and disbelief. They didn't see the SEAL trident she had earned years ago, only the calm, composed instructor guiding them through punches, blocks, and stances. Beck loved it. Teaching wasn't about power. It was about control, confidence, and instilling the realization that courage was a choice. Her students were fascinated by her background, though she shared little. Occasionally, she would allow a story, carefully edited, brief, and without unnecessary details of combat. Trust your instincts. Use control. Respect is everything. That was the message she delivered consistently, and they absorbed it, wide-eyed and determined. One evening, after a particularly long class, she was locking up when she spotted a familiar sight. A group of black leather jackets leaning against the corner store down the street. The Steel Vulture's MC. Her stomach tightened. Her pulse didn't spike. That was control. But her mind instantly switched into assessment mode. Their bikes were lined up like predators, polished and threatening. Their leader, Tank, stood at the center, gesturing loudly. The same cocky smirk plastered across his face from the diner incident. They hadn't recognized her yet. Beck's first instinct was to remain invisible, to let them pass without incident. But she noticed something more alarming. Locals were avoiding eye contact, hurrying inside shops, lowering voices. There was fear in the town, subtle but tangible. The vultures weren't just drunk and loud. They were escalating. Threats, intimidation, small-time extortion. And no one was stopping them. She took a deep breath, the kind she had learned in Hell Week, when oxygen was rationed and the body screamed for air. Her mind cleared. This wasn't about personal vendetta. It was about protecting her community, about restoring order in a place that had forgotten it existed. Over the next few days, Beck began quiet observation. She didn't confront them immediately. She didn't need to. From her pickup parked 2 blocks away, she tracked their routines, times they gathered, who was present, and their vulnerabilities. She documented it all discreetly, her notebook precise, methodical, almost military in execution. At the same time, she faced the ongoing challenges of civilian life. Sleep was elusive. Her nights were haunted by fragments of deployments, helicopters slicing through darkness, the sound of distant gunfire, and faces of people she had saved and lost. Civilians didn't understand her silences, or the way she scanned every room instinctively. To them, she was just a quiet woman who preferred solitude. To Beck, it was survival. Despite this, she continued teaching her classes, pouring herself into them. Her students noticed subtle changes in her demeanor, sharper instructions, heightened awareness, an almost imperceptible tension in her posture. But they assumed it was part of her discipline as an instructor. Only Beck knew it was vigilance, a preparation for what was coming. One afternoon, she encountered Mr. Jenkins, a retired veteran who ran the local grocery store. He nervously approached her as she stocked supplies in her studio. "They're getting worse," he whispered. "The bikers. They beat people up if they don't pay. Even the owners here are scared. Please, just be careful." Beck studied him carefully. His eyes were wide with fear, hands trembling slightly. She nodded calmly. "I'll watch," she said softly. "But fear doesn't solve anything. You can't let them control you with it." The old man looked at her, as if she were speaking another language. In a way, she was. Her perspective had been shaped by missions and training that no ordinary citizen could imagine. She wasn't reckless. She wasn't impulsive. She was calculating, patient, and prepared to act only when the moment was right. That night, Beck sat in her apartment again, tracing maps in her notebook, connecting streets, alleyways, and hangouts. She didn't plan violence. She planned strategy, observation, timing, evidence, precision. Her phone buzzed with messages from her students, reminders about classes, thank you notes, small glimpses of normal life. They didn't know that a storm was brewing, that the men who had humiliated her in a diner were now terrorizing their community. Beck's lips pressed into a thin line. She hadn't decided to intervene yet, but she knew the time would come. The following days reinforced her concerns. The biker's antics grew bolder, intimidating the diner owner who had served her, threatening shopkeepers, and leaving cars vandalized. Beck drove past one afternoon, casually scanning the area while pretending to run errands. She noticed how they checked their surroundings, looked for witnesses, and threatened anyone who hesitated. It was systematic. This was no longer just about her personal insult. This was about control, fear, and escalation, a problem that no one else in the town seemed willing or capable of stopping. And Beck, as quietly as she had always operated, began preparing for the confrontation she knew would eventually happen. She returned home that evening, walked along the coast, and let the rhythm of the waves wash over her. Her thoughts were methodical. Patience, observation, timing. She replayed the diner incident in her mind, how they underestimated her. They had no idea who they had disrespected, and soon they would learn. For now, she focused on her training, both hers and her students. She refined techniques, ran drills, and strengthened the community she could protect. Every moment, every step, every exercise was another layer of preparation. Beck understood that in life, as in combat, victory often belonged to the person who waited, calculated, and struck with precision. By the time night fell, she was back at her apartment, notebook open, jotting down notes on the gang's patterns. The city lights twinkled like distant stars, oblivious to the storm brewing in their midst. Beck poured herself a cup of coffee, tracing her finger across the page. She wasn't scared. She never had been. The bikers might think the world belonged to them, that their laughter and intimidation could bend people to their will. But Beck knew something they would never understand. Strength wasn't loud, and courage didn't need recognition. The moment for confrontation wasn't now, but it was coming. And when it did, she would be ready, calm, precise, and unstoppable. She closed her notebook, walked to the window, and gazed at the Pacific Ocean, stretching endlessly before her. The waves whispered promises of patience, persistence, and power. Beck whispered back softly, almost to herself, "The world doesn't know me yet, but they will." That night, sleep came slowly, but when it did, it was deep and unbroken, the kind only those trained to endure can achieve. Tomorrow, she would continue teaching, observing, and preparing. And in her mind, she knew the day would arrive when patience, discipline, and experience would meet arrogance, and the lesson would be unforgettable. Days blurred into nights as Rebecca Lawson continued her careful observation of the steel vultures. See, what had begun as idle curiosity had evolved into something far more serious. The biker gang's intimidation tactics were escalating. Rumors from shopkeepers and neighbors painted a grim picture. The gang was shaking down local businesses, vandalizing property, and physically assaulting anyone who refused to comply. Rebecca spent mornings jogging along the coast, the ocean's rhythm steadying her mind, while afternoons were spent in her studio teaching self-defense. Yet even in these routine tasks, her awareness never faltered. Every glance out a window, every sound from the street, every shift in shadows triggered a mental assessment. Positions, exits, potential threats. She began cataloging incidents in her notebook. Times of day the bikers struck, vehicles used, methods of intimidation. Her attention to detail was meticulous, a skill honed through years of Navy SEAL operations. Nothing was insignificant. Every small action, every small threat was a puzzle piece. And Rebecca intended to see the full picture before taking action. One evening, as the sun dipped low and bathed the town in gold, she visited Mr. Peterson, an elderly store owner who had been harassed multiple times. His front window was cracked, and a note scrawled in black marker warned him to pay the gang's protection fee. "They're getting bolder," he whispered, voice quivering. "I can't even leave my store without worrying what they'll do next." Rebecca nodded slowly. Her expression was calm, almost unreadable. "Fear doesn't solve anything," she said. "It only lets them control you. I'll make sure this stops." He blinked at her, unsure if she was joking. Most of the town thought the bikers were untouchable, but Rebecca's confidence was different. It was measured, precise, and dangerous in its quietness. Later that night, she drove past the biker hangout, pretending to run errands. The steel vultures lounged outside, engines rumbling, laughing at nothing in particular. She noted patterns: who arrived first, who guarded the entrance, and how long they stayed. Every observation was catalogued, every potential weakness logged in her notebook. Rebecca had no intention of confronting them in haste. She understood the value of patience. In combat, one rushed move could cost lives, hers or others. Timing and preparation were everything. Her plan wasn't to attack. Her plan was to dismantle them carefully, methodically, and without giving them any advantage. While observing, she also noticed collateral damage. Local teens intimidated, elderly shopkeepers walking on edge, and mothers keeping children inside. The gang wasn't just a nuisance. They were a threat to the fabric of her community. This realization cemented her resolve. Her next actions would not be personal revenge. They would be necessary intervention. She reached out discreetly to her old commanding officer, Lieutenant Commander Harris, who had overseen her deployments. "I need advice," she said cautiously over the phone. "There's a group here. They're escalating. Harassment, assault. I'm considering stepping in." Harris' voice was calm but firm. "Beck, you're not on a mission anymore. Remember that. The law exists for a reason. Don't cross that line. Observation, evidence. You know the drill." Rebecca exhaled, appreciating his caution. She wasn't reckless. She had survived Hell Week, missions in hostile territory, and threats from men trained to kill. She could handle herself. But she understood the value of combining strategy with patience. Over the next week, the bikers' aggression increased. They confronted a local veteran, Mr. Hall, who refused to pay their protection fee. The confrontation escalated into a violent attack. By the time the police were alerted, the men were gone, leaving Mr. Hall with bruises and a fractured wrist. Rebecca went to visit him at his home. The moment she entered, he sighed, a mix of relief and exhaustion. "You've seen them?" he asked, eyes wary. "They're unstoppable." "They think they are," she said calmly. "But there's always a way to level the playing field." Her mind calculated quietly, considering angles, weaknesses, and timing. She assessed the men's movements like a mission planner studying enemy positions. Observation was her weapon, patience her ally, and preparation her armor. That night, she returned to her apartment and spread maps across her desk. The town streets, alleyways, and key locations were marked. Patterns emerged: predictable times, recurring hangouts, and a hierarchy within the gang. Every detail mattered. She ran simulations in her mind, visualizing the gang's potential actions and how she could counter them. This wasn't thrill-seeking. This was professional planning. Every step she considered minimized risk to herself and to innocence. Despite the growing threat, Rebecca remained composed in public. She continued teaching self-defense classes, running along the coastline, and performing mundane errands, all while keeping a vigilant eye on the steel vultures. Her students, unaware of the storm brewing in her mind, noticed her quiet intensity. "You've changed a little," one student remarked after class. "You're sharper." Beck smiled faintly. "Life teaches lessons in subtle ways. The key is noticing them before it's too late." As the week drew on, she saw the gang target the diner where the first incident had occurred. They demanded money from the owner and laughed as he fumbled nervously. The memories of the spit in her face resurfaced, not with rage, but with a clear understanding of what must be done. She didn't act immediately. She stayed across the street in her truck, watching, timing, and recording everything. Each laugh, each threat, each shove was noted. Her mind catalogued weaknesses, positioning, and the safest ways to intervene if necessary. By the time the sun set, casting long shadows across the town, Rebecca had a plan forming. It wasn't about revenge. It wasn't about violence for its own sake. It was about restoring balance, protecting the vulnerable, and making sure those who inflicted fear paid consequences proportionate to their actions. As she returned home that night, she allowed herself a brief reflection. Her journey from the dusty streets of Tucson, through the grueling SEAL training and into combat zones around the world, had prepared her for moments like this. A small-town gang might think they could intimidate a woman alone, but they didn't know who she really was. Rebecca looked out at the Pacific Ocean, its waves crashing relentlessly, mirroring her own inner resolve. Her patience was not weakness, it was preparation. The Steel Vultures MC were growing bolder, but they were walking into a situation calculated by someone who had mastered control, observation, and precision. She opened her notebook once more, jotting down details, timing, and contingencies. Each mark of the pen reinforced a singular truth. One day soon, arrogance and disrespect would meet its reckoning. And when that day arrived, Rebecca Lawson would be ready, calm, collected, unstoppable. For now, she trained. She observed. She waited. And the world, unaware of the storm quietly taking shape, carried on, oblivious to the precision, preparing to descend upon those who thought they ruled it. The diner had become a central point of tension in the small town, its neon sign flickering like a silent warning. The Steel Vultures MC had grown bolder with each passing day, harassing locals, extorting money, and intimidating anyone who dared resist. That evening, Rebecca Lawson parked her truck 2 blocks away, casually scanning the street as she approached Marty's diner. Her heartbeat was steady, a rhythm conditioned by years of discipline, endurance, and observation. Inside, the diner hummed with the usual chatter, the faint clatter of dishes, and the hiss of the coffee machine. Marty, the owner, glanced at Rebecca nervously, giving her a small nod as if to silently say, "They are here." Across the street, the rumble of motorcycles announced their arrival. 4 bikes, black and polished, their chrome catching the fading sunlight. Tank, the gang's leader, swaggered toward the diner with a grin that carried the arrogance of men who had never been stopped. Behind him, his crew followed, laughing, shouting, and oozing a sense of entitlement that had emboldened them for far too long. Rebecca stepped into the diner as the bikers pushed the door open. Conversations died instantly. The smell of gasoline and leather mingled with the aroma of fried food. Tank's eyes found hers. Recognition sparked, the woman from the diner weeks ago. He smirked, underestimating her entirely. "Well, well," he said, voice loud, dripping with condescension. "Look who it is. Navy Barbie. Come to see how real men handle the world?" His crew chuckled, bumping shoulders, making the space around them tense. Rebecca didn't flinch. She stood tall, her posture unyielding, a calm yet lethal presence that made even regular patrons inch away instinctively. "Leave," she said softly, but with the precision of command. Tank laughed and leaned closer, sneering. "Or what? You'll bite me?" His laughter, meant to intimidate, only revealed his ignorance. He didn't know her. He didn't know what she had endured, what she had trained for, or how many lives she had calculated in seconds. Tank's crew started encircling her booth, trying to make her feel trapped. But Rebecca's eyes scanned the room with rapid, practiced assessment. Exits, positions, distances, potential improvised weapons. Every inch of the environment was in her mind, catalogued like a SEAL, mapping a hostile zone. Then, without warning, Tank swung. The motion was reckless, driven by overconfidence. Rebecca moved almost invisibly, sidestepped, twisted his arm, and dropped him to the floor with a controlled leverage move that left him groaning. Not a hair was out of place on her uniform, not a muscle wasted. The diner went silent. Patrons stared, mouths agape. Tank's crew froze, shock replacing their earlier bravado. Their leader, the man who thought he could intimidate her with words, now lay on the floor, fully aware of the miscalculation he had made. Rebecca's voice cut through the stunned silence, calm and unwavering. "You wanted to know what a SEAL looks like? Now you do." The words weren't a threat. They were a statement. a truth these men were slow to realize. Tank tried to rise, anger flashing in his eyes, but his body refused. Trained muscle, precision, and leverage had rendered him temporarily incapacitated. The other bikers hesitated, looking at each other nervously. Something about her presence, the calm authority in her gaze, was unsettling. Rebecca moved deliberately, positioning herself strategically. 1 step left, 2 steps back, ensuring distance while maintaining control of the situation. The diner became her operational zone, and she was in command. "Now," she said, voice soft but firm, "you're leaving, and you're never coming back." The bikers looked to Tank, who sputtered, trying to recover his bravado. But fear had settled into the group, a subtle but undeniable shift. For the first time, they were confronted not by chaos, but by control and expertise. A patron finally broke the silence, picking up their phone to record. Others watched, some whispering to each other, stunned by what they were witnessing. This wasn't just a fight. This was precision in motion, a lesson in consequences these men would never forget. Rebecca didn't strike again. She didn't need to. Her presence, her control, and the single calculated maneuver against Tank communicated everything. The power dynamics had shifted instantly. The bikers stumbled out of the diner, murmuring threats they no longer believed. Tank glared at her one last time, realizing the miscalculation that had cost him his pride. He and his crew mounted their bikes and roared off, leaving a stunned silence behind them. Marty approached, voice trembling. "Beck, you handled that perfectly. I've never seen." Rebecca waved her hand, dismissing the praise. "It's over," she said. "They won't come back." She knew, however, that while the immediate threat had passed, the larger challenge wasn't gone. The bikers were unpredictable, volatile, and emboldened by arrogance. But Rebecca had something far more dangerous than arrogance: discipline, preparation, and patience. That night, she sat at her apartment, overlooking the coast, coffee in hand, replaying every moment of the encounter. Every detail mattered: Tank's weight, his swing, the timing of her sidestep, the leverage applied. She documented it all meticulously in her notebook, analyzing the sequence for future contingencies. Her mind shifted to the bigger picture. The town, the community, the vulnerable, all needed protection. The lesson wasn't just for Tank and his crew. It was for anyone who thought intimidation could control others. Respect, she had learned over decades of training and experience, could not be demanded. It could only be earned or enforced through measured action. Rebecca also reflected on herself, the calm that had allowed her to handle the situation. It wasn't instinct alone. It was years of conditioning, discipline, and the understanding that power without control is meaningless. She had acted precisely because she had observed, waited, and then struck at the exact right moment. By morning, news of the confrontation had spread. The video from a patron's phone was already circulating online. Navy SEAL woman defends diner against biker gang. Comments flooded social media, some praising her courage, others questioning her methods. Rebecca paid no attention. Public opinion didn't matter. Control, discipline, and protection did. Authorities arrived later that day, interviewing witnesses and reviewing footage. Rebecca provided her detailed notes, times, patterns, and behaviors. Her evidence was clear, structured, and compelling. The police began connecting the dots that had eluded them for weeks. Rebecca didn't boast, didn't celebrate. She poured herself another cup of coffee and walked to her window, watching the town resume its rhythm. The diner was calm again, the air now tinged with relief and disbelief. She knew the bikers would be back eventually, and others might follow in their footsteps. But now, the dynamic had changed. The message was clear. Arrogance and disrespect had consequences, and underestimation could be deadly. Rebecca allowed herself a brief, quiet smile. The operation, her careful observation, patience, and strategic control, had succeeded without unnecessary escalation. She had neutralized the immediate threat, protected the vulnerable, and prepared the groundwork for larger consequences if the gang persisted. For the first time in weeks, she felt a flicker of peace. Not pride, not satisfaction, peace. She knew she had done what needed to be done. And she knew that when the next challenge came, whether from Tank, his crew, or others emboldened by fearlessness, she would be ready. Rebecca returned to her apartment, opened her notebook, and wrote a single line. Disrespect meets consequence. Always. Patience is preparation. Precision is power. The night was quiet, the waves relentless, a reminder of patience and force, subtle but undeniable. She sipped her coffee, knowing the storm was far from over. But she also knew that, for now, the first move had been hers. The morning after the diner confrontation, Rebecca Lawson awoke to the shrill buzz of her phone. Notifications poured in, messages from concerned townspeople, students, and strangers who had seen the video online. The recording of her controlled and precise defense against the Steel Vulture's MC had gone viral. Headlines shouted, Navy SEAL woman stops biker gang in diner showdown. Rebecca stared at the screen, coffee in hand, letting the information wash over her. She wasn't thrilled by attention, nor did she seek it. Her objective had never been fame. It had always been control, protection, and discipline. But the reach of the video meant one undeniable truth. The biker gang's arrogance had been publicly exposed, and their intimidation tactics were no longer invisible. Authorities soon arrived at her door. Sheriff Daniels, a middle-aged man with graying hair and a measured demeanor, stepped inside, extending a hand. Rebecca, he said, his voice a mixture of relief and admiration. I've watched the footage. Incredible control. We could use your help in identifying patterns and threats. This gang has been terrorizing the town for months. Rebecca nodded, her calm professionalism unwavering. I documented everything, she replied, handing over her notebook filled with maps, observations, and timing sequences. Each page detailed movements, hierarchies, and potential weaknesses of the gang. The sheriff studied the notebook, impressed. You've done what we couldn't, and you did it without putting anyone else at risk. Meanwhile, social media commentary surged. Opinions were divided. Some hailed her as a hero, praising her courage and discipline. Others criticized her for taking the law into her own hands. Comments poured in. Dangerous vigilante. Versus finally, someone stands up to bullies. Rebecca scrolled only briefly, noting patterns, but refusing to be distracted by sensationalism. She understood the dynamics of public perception. It mattered little compared to strategy, preparation, and execution. Locals approached cautiously throughout the day. Shopkeepers thanked her, timid but grateful. The diner owner, Marty, brought over a basket of food. I can't believe you did that, he said, voice shaking. They've been a nightmare for months. You stopped them. Rebecca waved his gratitude away, focusing instead on what mattered. They won't come back today, she said. But we have to stay vigilant. Arrogance like theirs doesn't vanish overnight. That afternoon, the sheriff gathered his deputies. They reviewed Rebecca's observations and matched them with prior reports. Arrests were planned. Evidence was collected. The gang's hierarchy, behavior patterns, and known locations were all meticulously documented, much of it thanks to Rebecca's careful notes. Despite this, Rebecca remained calm. The real work, she knew, wasn't over. The bikers could be angry, reckless, and unpredictable, qualities that made them dangerous. But now, the dynamics had shifted. The town's fear had lessened, replaced by cautious optimism. And for the first time, The bikers were the ones being scrutinized. Even the media began arriving, journalists hoping for interviews. Cameras flashed as she walked down the street, maintaining her composed demeanor. Questions were asked, some invasive, some naive, but Rebecca answered with the same precision she had in combat, measured, factual, and without unnecessary emotion. "She's incredible," one reporter murmured to a colleague. "Not just brave, but disciplined. That's rare." At night, back in her apartment, Rebecca reflected on the day's events. She had disrupted a gang, aided law enforcement, and restored a measure of safety to her community. But she also knew the danger wasn't eliminated. The Steel Vultures MC were clever, violent, and angry. They would regroup. Her phone buzzed again. A message from Lieutenant Commander Harris, her former commanding officer. Saw the coverage. "Good work, Beck. Remember, victory isn't just action. It's preparation for what comes next. Don't underestimate them." She smiled faintly at the reminder. Harris had always emphasized that discipline extended beyond the immediate mission. The bikers were a problem, but their behavior was now constrained by visibility, documentation, and consequence. The lesson they would learn would be significant. Over the next few days, arrests began. Sheriff Daniels' team, aided by Rebecca's detailed notes, apprehended gang members one by one. Tank, the leader, was initially elusive, but surveillance and tips from locals allowed authorities to track him down. Each arrest sent ripples through the town. The fear that had gripped shopkeepers, mothers, and teenagers began to dissipate. Rebecca continued teaching her self-defense classes, reinforcing lessons not just of physical technique, but of confidence, observation, and mental preparedness. She emphasized that courage wasn't about fighting recklessly, but about control and clarity under pressure. Her students absorbed every word, inspired not only by her skill, but by the calm authority that had neutralized the bikers without unnecessary chaos. Even as the arrests continued, Rebecca remained vigilant. She understood human nature. Tank and his crew were volatile, likely planning retaliation, but the legal consequences now acted as a buffer. Their recklessness had been captured on video, their movements tracked. In short, they were exposed. The town slowly returned to normal, but with a heightened sense of awareness. Patrons returned to the diner. Shopkeepers reopened stores they had temporarily closed, and children cautiously ventured outside. The change was subtle but profound, a community no longer controlled by fear. Rebecca, however, didn't celebrate. She never sought accolades. Her reflection on the day's events was quiet, internal. She knew the real victory wasn't viral videos or public praise. It was the restoration of safety, respect, and control, values that could not be taken lightly. Late one night, she sat on her balcony, gazing at the Pacific Ocean. The waves were relentless, patient, and powerful, a mirror of her own approach. Victory, she knew, was never a single moment. It was a series of deliberate, calculated actions, combined with patience, discipline, and foresight. Her phone buzzed once more. Another message from a local shopkeeper. "Thank you. I can finally sleep again." Rebecca didn't reply. She simply sipped her coffee and watched the horizon. She had taught a lesson far beyond physical confrontation. Arrogance, disrespect, and intimidation had boundaries. And when those boundaries were crossed, consequences followed, precise, unavoidable, and undeniable. The night grew quiet. Social media buzzed in the background, but Rebecca's mind was focused on preparation, not fame. She cataloged each observation, noting potential contingencies, the gang's likely reactions, and the town's evolving dynamics. Her calm was not complacency. It was strategic readiness. By dawn, Rebecca knew the town had shifted subtly, but irrevocably. Fear had lost its grip. The Steel Vultures MC had been humbled, not through chaos, but through controlled, decisive action. And while the aftermath would continue to unfold, one truth was undeniable. Disrespecting a Navy SEAL had consequences far beyond what arrogance could predict. She poured herself another cup of coffee, looking at the sunlight glinting off the waves. The world outside might never fully understand the discipline, preparation, and patience that had brought the town back from fear. But that didn't matter. What mattered was action with purpose, and the community was safer because of it. Rebecca closed her notebook, letting the pages of observation, strategy, and precision rest. For now, the immediate threat had been neutralized. But she remained vigilant, ready for any escalation, and unwavering in her control. The lesson had been taught. The town had witnessed it. And the world, even if just a small corner of it, had learned that disrespecting a Navy SEAL was a mistake no one could afford to repeat. Weeks had passed since the viral diner incident. The Steel Vultures MC had been publicly humiliated, some members arrested, and their intimidation tactics under legal scrutiny. Yet Rebecca Lawson knew the real reckoning was far from over. Arrogance and resentment could simmer quietly, waiting for the right moment to strike back. The gang wasn't defeated. They were cornered, dangerous, unpredictable, and desperate. It began subtly. Messages left on her car, fleeting shadows outside her apartment, and whispered threats directed at townspeople. The law had constraints, but Rebecca had no illusions. These men thrived on fear and chaos. If unchecked, they would escalate. Her vigilance never wavered. Then came the legal challenge. The gang, emboldened by their resources and brazen in their arrogance, hired an attorney to press charges against her, claiming assault and intimidation. The news hit the town like a shockwave. Some locals feared she might be punished for defending herself and the diner. Others worried about the legal battle draining her focus and energy. Rebecca didn't panic. Calm, precise, and methodical, she began preparation in earnest. She reviewed every moment of the confrontation, every angle of the video footage, every statement she had documented. Her notes from observation became evidence. The gang's prior harassment, threats, and patterns of behavior were meticulously detailed. What looked like arrogance to outsiders was precision to her, a detailed record that left no loophole. She met with her attorney, a seasoned professional who understood both the legal system and the value of strategic evidence. "Rebecca, this could go either way in court," he said cautiously. "They'll argue provocation, claim you overreacted." Rebecca's response was calm, measured. "I documented everything. Their patterns, threats, behavior. Every move they made was recorded. This isn't reaction. This is fact." She spent nights reconstructing the timeline in her mind. The diner incident, the initial harassment, the threats, and every prior interaction. She reviewed her own actions, calm, controlled, and legally defensible. In the military, she had learned that evidence, precision, and control could turn a volatile situation into a calculated advantage. Now, she applied the same principles in civilian life. When the court date arrived, the atmosphere was electric. Media lined the hallways. Locals filled the benches, many anxious to see justice served. The Steel Vultures MC members entered confidently, trying to project intimidation. But their leader, Tank, carried a subtle tension beneath his bravado, the memory of that calculated sidestep, the fall, and the public humiliation haunted him. Rebecca entered the courtroom with quiet authority. She didn't need to assert dominance with loud words or dramatic gestures. Her posture, calm demeanor, and composed presence conveyed more than any speech could. The judge, a seasoned professional, recognized the weight of the evidence and the subtle but undeniable authority Rebecca carried. Tank's attorney attempted to paint her as a provocateur, exaggerating the incident and twisting her defense into aggression. But Rebecca, guided by preparation and clarity, provided a concise, factual account. She described the gang's repeated harassment, threats, and intimidation tactics. Her evidence was undeniable: messages, video footage, eyewitness testimony, and her own detailed observation notes. Every detail was precise, leaving no room for ambiguity. Witnesses from the diner testified, recounting the fear and intimidation, reinforcing the systematic harassment by the gang. Even the shopkeepers she had protected provided statements, corroborating the pattern of threats and attacks. The court began to see the truth clearly. Rebecca Lawson hadn't overreacted. She had intervened with discipline, control, and proportionality. During cross-examination, the gang attempted to twist her words, suggesting she had sought revenge. Rebecca remained calm, her responses measured, her eyes steady. "This isn't about retaliation," she said softly but firmly. "This is about preventing harm. Observation, assessment, and appropriate action. That's what this was." The judge nodded, absorbing the clarity of her testimony and the overwhelming evidence. Even the defense began to falter, realizing that the narrative of victimization they had tried to construct collapsed under the weight of documented fact. Outside the courtroom, news reporters captured the aftermath. Headlines praised her as a hero, emphasizing not only her bravery but her strategic approach. "Navy SEAL woman uses discipline and evidence to defeat biker gang in court," read one. Social media buzzed with admiration. Yet Rebecca remained grounded. The public attention was irrelevant. What mattered was control, precision, and protection. She had neutralized the threat legally, ensuring the gang could no longer operate unchecked. The lesson they had learned was reinforced not only through physical confrontation, but through lawful, undeniable action. Back in her apartment that evening, Rebecca reflected on the events. The city outside was calm, the threat diminished but not entirely gone. The Steel Vulture's MC had been exposed, humbled, and legally constrained. They had underestimated her twice, first in the diner, then in the courtroom, and each miscalculation had consequences. Rebecca poured herself a cup of coffee, opened her notebook, and reviewed the timeline once more. She documented not only the events, but the lessons learned, patience, observation, preparation, and controlled execution. Each note was a reminder that discipline was the ultimate weapon. Her students returned to class the next week, unaware of the courtroom drama. Rebecca continued teaching, focusing on self-defense and confidence. Her lessons went beyond physical technique. She instilled in them the importance of mental preparedness, observation, and calm under pressure. "You don't fight because you want to," she told her students. "You fight because you must. And when you do, every move must be deliberate, precise, and controlled." Her words resonated, inspired not just by skill, but by lived experience. The incident with the bikers had reinforced everything she had learned, from Hell Week to combat deployments. Discipline, strategy, and preparation were not just military concepts. They were life principles. Weeks later, Tank and his crew were serving sentences or under strict probation. The town, once fearful, had regained confidence. Shops reopened, children played safely, and the diner thrived without fear of harassment. The public humiliation had broken the gang's psychological grip, and the legal consequences ensured they could not easily rise again. Rebecca, however, remained vigilant. She knew the world was unpredictable, and arrogance often found new ways to manifest. But she also knew that preparedness, discipline, and strategic action could counter almost any threat. One evening she walked along the coast, waves crashing rhythmically below. The serenity of the ocean reminded her of her Navy SEAL days, the importance of patience, timing, and observation. She smiled faintly, knowing that the storm had passed for now. Her notebook lay open on the desk, back in her apartment, filled with precise records and reflections. She closed it with a quiet sense of accomplishment. The reckoning had been delivered through calm, strategy, and undeniable authority. Arrogance had met its match. Disrespect had consequences, and discipline always prevailed. Rebecca Lawson, Navy SEAL, survivor, and protector, remained ready. The town slept easier, the community was safer, and the lesson had been taught. Never underestimate someone prepared, disciplined, and willing to act when the moment is right. As the night deepened, she whispered to herself, almost in reflection, "Respect is earned. Threats have limits. And patience ensures that when the time comes, every action hits with precision." The lesson was clear, the reckoning complete. And while the future held unknown challenges, one truth was undeniable. Rebecca Lawson was a force that could not be ignored, and those who disrespected her had learned that lesson the hard way. Months had passed since the courtroom victory. The Steel Vultures MC were either behind bars, on probation, or under strict surveillance. Their influence over the town had vanished like smoke, leaving a quieter, more confident community in its place. But Rebecca Lawson knew the lesson she had taught extended beyond arrests and courtroom rulings. Discipline, strategy, and respect were principles that could not be ignored, and she had enforced them in a way the bikers would never forget. The town had slowly returned to a sense of normalcy. Marty's diner buzzed with laughter again. Shopkeepers walked proudly without fear, and children played freely in the streets. Rebecca's classes had grown in size. Her students now not only learning self-defense techniques, but also understanding the importance of mental resilience, observation, and strategic thinking. Even so, Rebecca remained vigilant. Her experiences as a Navy SEAL had taught her that peace could be fleeting, and arrogance could resurface at any time. She spent her mornings jogging along the coast, her eyes constantly scanning her surroundings, and her evenings teaching or reviewing notes. Each action was deliberate, each movement controlled, a reflection of a life forged in precision and discipline. Then one evening, a subtle disturbance caught her attention. A black SUV idled near the outskirts of town, its occupants observing the diner discreetly. Rebecca noticed the details immediately. Tinted windows, one passenger taking photos with a high-end camera, movements calculated and cautious. Tank's voice, she thought, or someone trying to take up his mantle. But she remained calm. There was no panic, no unnecessary confrontation. She had dealt with arrogance before, and she knew the approach: observe, assess, prepare, and act with precision. Rebecca decided to take action preemptively. She coordinated with Sheriff Daniels, discreetly providing the details she had observed. Surveillance units were placed subtly around town, documenting every movement without drawing attention. Within hours, the SUV's occupants were approached by law enforcement and taken in for questioning. It became immediately clear that the gang, or those aligned with them, had been attempting to intimidate locals once again, but the town was no longer vulnerable. Later that night, Rebecca walked along the coastline, waves crashing rhythmically below. Her mind reflected on the months that had passed, the diner incident, the courtroom, and now this final, subtle test of the gang's arrogance. Each challenge had been met with calm precision, and each lesson had been reinforced. Disrespect carried consequences, and discipline was unmatched power. She returned home and opened her notebook, flipping through pages filled with observation, analysis, and reflections. Every encounter, every potential threat had been documented, studied, and anticipated. Rebecca smiled faintly, recognizing a pattern. It wasn't force alone that defeated threats, but strategy applied with patience and authority. Her students, oblivious to the latest SUV incident, continued their classes. One of them, a young woman named Claire, approached Rebecca after training. "You make it look so easy," Claire said, breathless. "How do you stay so calm?" Rebecca studied her for a moment and replied softly, "Calm isn't the absence of danger. Calm is knowing you've prepared, understanding your environment, and trusting your skills. Fear is normal. Control is a choice." Claire nodded, absorbing the lesson, and walked away with newfound confidence. Rebecca knew the ripple effect of her actions extended far beyond immediate confrontations. The town, her students, and the people who had once cowered under the gang's threats were now empowered by example, strategy, and unwavering composure. A week later, the final confrontation with the gang, or at least what remained of their network, was formalized through law enforcement. Evidence from Rebecca's careful documentation, combined with digital surveillance and eyewitness accounts, ensured that any remaining members faced justice. Tank, now isolated and humiliated, was serving a sentence that would prevent him from returning to the town. His crew, stripped of influence and credibility, dispersed. Rebecca did not celebrate publicly. Her satisfaction was quiet, internal, and grounded in the knowledge that the lesson had been delivered fully and conclusively. She reflected on the journey, the diner incident, the viral video, courtroom battles, and the final containment of threats. Each moment had required discipline, observation, and precise action. That evening, as the sun set over the horizon, Rebecca walked the cliffside trail, letting the ocean breeze carry away tension and stress. She paused to look out at the waves, reflecting on the months of challenges and victories. The town was safe, the threats neutralized, and respect, once ignored, had been restored. Rebecca's phone buzzed. It was a message from Marty, the diner owner. "Thanks again. You didn't just protect me. You protected the town. People are sleeping easier now?" She typed a short response. It wasn't just me. Preparedness and vigilance work together. Everyone has a role in keeping their community safe. Her eyes wandered back to the ocean. She knew that in life, threats would always exist. Arrogance and intimidation were constants in human behavior. But so were preparation, discipline, and calm authority, traits she had cultivated over a lifetime of training and experience. Rebecca returned home and placed her notebook on the desk, closing it gently. It was a record not only of the events themselves, but of lessons learned, patience in the face of provocation, precision over impulse, and the ultimate power of disciplined action. Later, she sat with a cup of coffee, reflecting on the full journey. The Steel Vulture's MC had underestimated her. They had spat in her face, assumed she was just another civilian, and sought to intimidate a small town. In return, they had faced not reckless fury, but calculated, controlled, and undeniable consequence. They had learned, at every stage, that disrespecting a Navy SEAL carried consequences far beyond expectation. Rebecca's life returned to a new rhythm. Classes, training, observation, and the occasional consultation with law enforcement became her routine. The town had healed, and the lesson of respect had been cemented permanently. Before turning in that night, Rebecca wrote a final line in her notebook. "The world respects discipline. Arrogance is its own downfall. Preparedness is power, and patience delivers justice." She set the notebook down, took one last sip of coffee, and looked out at the peaceful, moonlit ocean. The waves whispered the rhythm of life, constant and unyielding, much like her own resolve. The danger had passed, but the principle remained eternal. Disrespect carries consequences, and those who underestimate prepared, disciplined individuals will always learn the hard way. Rebecca Lawson, Navy SEAL, protector, and strategist, closed her eyes that night with quiet confidence. She had delivered every lesson necessary, safeguarded her community, and ensured that arrogance and disrespect would never again dominate the lives of those who had once been victims. The final chapter was written. The town slept soundly, and for anyone who thought they could intimidate, belittle, or challenge her, The lesson was clear. Rebecca Lawson was a force that demanded respect, and she would always be ready.